Hey, welcome back to the Urban Monk. Man, it's been a while. I am excited to be podcasting again with all the travels and things going on. Sometimes I miss just sitting around talking to really interesting people, and today I've got a good one for you. Todd White is personal friend, lovely, lovely guy. Great to see him anytime I can, and he's the guy that brings pretty much everyone I know their quality wines. And we're going to talk about what a quality wine is because there's just a lot of shit out there. Todd knows his stuff. He's been traveling the world and who really understands the supply chain. My whole thing was, the auspices under which we met was like, oh yeah, this is great, but I don't drink wine. Why not? I'm like, because it gives me a freaking headache. He's like, this won't. I'm like, come on, right? And so I took the Pepsi challenge and I did not have a headache. And I said, dude, what's the difference? And that opened up a really long dialogue about the difference in, the quality wines and how they used to be made and, just all the crap that's put into things that we think are, naturally sourced, especially in California. So without further ado, Todd, welcome to the show.
Thanks, man. I'm super happy to be here. There's just a lot to know about what is in your wine today. So super excited to get started on that.
Yeah, and so it turns out I'm not a fan of California wines anymore. I thought, living in California and, having the wine tasting experience and all that I, lived in the creme de la creme. And once in a while you get a Bordeaux or some Italian wine. I didn't know the difference. But, wine is just a different creature than I understood it. And it is a lot more set, dressed, and manufactured than I understood. So let's talk about like what people are doing to wine, and then just dive into like what wine used to be, or you know what you could pick the order of how we talk about this, and let's just jump in.
Well, there's some really dirty, dark secrets in the wine business. And so wine is sold through story and wine is sold through romance, and that's how wine is marketed. The fact is, what it really is and what it pretends to be are usually two different things. So all wines used to be made naturally and wholesomely some 50, 60 plus years ago. But with corporate greed and an attention to profit and monies, wine started to change. And so what's happened to the wine supply is exactly what's happened to our food supply. So there's been massive corporate consolidation. In fact, 52% of all wines manufactured in the United States are made by just three giant wine conglomerates. The top 30 companies, wine manufacturers in the United States, make over 70% of the wines. Now, you don't know that because when you go to the store, there are hundreds of bottles, most of them being made by the same people. You don't know that because they hide behind thousands, tens of thousands of brands and labels to confuse you, to have you believe you're drinking from a farmhouse when in fact you're drinking from a massive factory in Central California. So here's the problem. In addition to farming, which we can get into in a moment, but there's a whole the farming, the death of soil, irrigation. There's a whole bunch on the farming side that's quite detrimental, not only to your health but to the vines and to the wine. But what's happening in the cellar is really quite disturbing as well. So there are 76 additives approved by the FDA for the use in winemaking. By the way, all of the facts, this kind of nastiness about the wine industry I'm going to share with you, are all easily verifiable just by going to a Google search. You can see the top wine manufacturers and percentage of wine that they make. You can see this. You can search FDA approved wine additives and the list will come right up. So none of this is, the wine industry's just done a really good job of keeping this secret until I came along. And I came along and sort of scratching my own itch. I was a lifelong wine lover and aficionado. I couldn't drink wines anymore. They were making me sick. I was waking up with brain fog. I was like, I live in the heart of the most important wine appellation in North America. I live in Napa Valley. I moved here to drink wine. And so when I discovered what was really going on, and even people in the industry don't know about it, some don't even understand it. I mean, it's just, this is just such a dark secret, but here are the facts. There's 76 additives approved by the FDA for the use in winemaking. And the reason you don't know about that is a little more troubling. The reason you don't know is because the wine industry has spent tens of millions of dollars in lobby money with their friends in Washington, D.C. to keep contents labeling and nutritional information off of wine. So wine is the only major food product without a contents label. Now, the reason they don't want a contents label on it is because it's filled with all these toxins and chemicals and additives. And so that's the reason, and they've been very successful in keeping contents labeling off of wine, and I expect they'll continue to be successful with it. So these additives, some of which are quite dangerous, one is so toxic. It's an additive used to treat the most common bacterial fault in wine, known as Brettanomyces. And it's so toxic that when it's applied to the wine, the winery has to be cleared and vacant. They use a specially licensed contractor who comes in hazmat suits and applies this chemical to the wine. If you drank the wine within 24 hours of application, you would die. And the government still allows up to 200 parts per million of this residual chemical legally to remain in the wine. So this is just sort of what's going on behind the scenes, and nobody really knows about it. So let's talk about what the differences are between conventional wines, those wines you see in the store, and what are known as natural wines, which is what I sell and drink. And by the way, I also don't sell or drink any domestic wine, including wines from California. There are no wine.
Shame.
Well, it is, but the fact is, while we would love to support American growers and vintners, but the problem is no one in the United States makes wine that meets our purity and health standards.
Yep.
And so there's only a few, just about 1,000 of these farms in the world, and most of them are located in Europe. I have 4 growers in South Africa, and there are 3 in Chile. The rest of them are spread across Europe, which is where the natural wine revolution began. When you say natural wine, is confusing to many people because they're like, well, aren't all wines natural? And for reasons we've already discussed, no, they're not. Most are not. And so it can be kind of a confusing term. But so natural wines are always organically or biodynamically farmed. In our case, they are never irrigated. We can talk about that if we have time.
I'd love to talk about that. That's fascinating to me.
Well, there's a whole bunch of problems with irrigation. Let's come back to it. So also, they are fermented, and this is a very critical distinction. They're fermented with wild native yeast. So on the skin of every wine grape in the world, yeast collects on the skin. It looks like a white waxy kind of covering on the grape, but it's actually yeast. And so with natural wines, this is one of the reasons natural wines cannot be made in very large quantities. With a natural wine, it is fermented with this wild native yeast that is indigenous to the vineyard where the grape is grown. In conventional wines, or wines you see in your store, those are not fermented with these wild native yeast. They are fermented with a genetically modified lab cultured yeast. Now, there's 3 reasons for that. First of all, the wild native yeast is temperamental and somewhat difficult to work with, and you can't make wine in very large quantities with native yeast. Because these lab cultured, genetically modified yeast are more sturdy and they're easier to work with, number 1. So job is easier. Number 2, they will withstand a high alcohol environment. And we're going to talk about alcohol in a moment. And so native yeast, a wild yeast, will not withstand a high alcohol environment. And alcohol has been steadily increasing in wines over the last 30 years, particularly in the United States. And we'll come back to alcohol in a moment, because one thing that everyone should understand very clearly from the wine guy is that alcohol is a super dangerous neurotoxin. And we're going to come back to that and why it's so dangerous and why that matters and how we should be thinking about our relationship with alcohol or any other kind of consciousness or any other kind of conscious altering substance that in this case, not in other altering substances necessarily, but in this case also happens to be addictive. So I really want to spend a few minutes talking about alcohol and its toxic dangers. So that's the second reason why native yeast are not used. And the third reason is with this genetically modified flavor profiling, what can happen is that with these genetically modified yeast is that the wine can be grown. Let's just say that you grow some shitty grapes in Central California, but you want to make this wine taste like it's from Italy. Well, they have a yeast for that, right? And so that's the reason that these lab grown yeast are used. They're just sturdy, they withstand high alcohol environments, and they can be used to enhance flavor profiles. For our health, we don't really know what it means because nobody's done any real research on these yeast and what effect they may be having on our health. What we do know is when we don't drink them, you feel better. So fermented with wild native yeast and then no additives and no adjustments. That's what a natural wine is. So it doesn't have any of these 76 additives. An adjustment could be the removal, using technology to remove alcohol as an example. It could be adding color or body additives to the wine. So I don't know if you've ever seen when people get purple teeth from drinking wine, right?
That's not the grape.
That's not the grape. That's actually a color agent. Natural wines will not stain your teeth or lips or gums in any way, shape, or form. And not all wines do, but when they do, they most often contain this color agent known as maga purple. Because there's a perception from consumers, particularly in the United States, that the darker a red wine is, the better quality it is. Now, there's no truth to that statement. In fact, I would argue that it's just the opposite. But that perception exists among consumers. Just like consumers also believe the more they pay for wine, the better it tastes. There's absolutely no truth to that either. There's a number of these sort of myths inside the wine world, or how consumers see it. But that's what constitutes a natural wine. And as I said, there's only about 1,000 farms in the world where this is practiced. Because there's not any money in it, you can't make natural wines in very large quantities. So most of these are just hippie activists who are obsessed with biodiversity and with living soils, right? And with following nature's logic in farming. So when you go to a natural wine, when you come to California and you go to a tasting room, it's all about the architecture in the tasting room and coming in and hospitality. It's not that way when you visit a natural farm. All they want to do is take you to the vineyard. They don't even have a tasting room, right? You would taste over their kitchen table or, a table that's shoved away in the side of the cellar somewhere or on a barrel top. They don't have this concept of hospitality as tasting rooms. The natural farmer wants you to come to the vineyard and talk about the soil and wants to pull the soil up and show you insects and the life of the soil. The natural wine farmer generally, most often, doesn't even plow his land. He doesn't want to upset the eco balance that is below the humus. There's this whole other world that's living down there that if it gets turned up and exposed to the sun, it's going to die, right? So it's just this very sacred activist sort of view of soils. They're just really interested in soil and minerality and sort of rocks and, kind of everything that's going on that is providing the nourishment and life for the plant. So that's just sort of what their kind of obsession is.
So, we did a whole episode on this in Interconnected about the life in the soil and how life begets life. And it's just a fascinating subject for me. One of the things that I want you to just quickly tease out is the difference between organic and biodynamic. And people hear all these words, but I don't think they understand what they are. I'd love for you to kind of help us with that.
Yeah, let me touch on that for just a second. So it's really easy to describe the differences between organic and biodynamic. Before I do that, I also want to mention just because a wine is organic or biodynamic does not mean it's naturally made. It just means
Mm.
that it's farmed in accordance with those practices of organic or biodynamic. Then when it gets to the cellar, it can still be subject to these commercial yeast and to other
Mm.
additives and heavy doses of sulfur dioxide to sterilize it and so on and so forth. So just because you go in Whole Foods and you
Mm.
see, quote, an organic wine doesn't mean that it's natural. So that being said, here's the difference. So, and I also want to touch on the difference between what we call loving organic in living soils and industrial organic. Now, they're both organic, they're both certified, but I want to talk about the difference of that in just a moment. But here's the difference between organic and biodynamic. So, biodynamic was developed by an Austrian scientist named Rudolf Steiner in 1925. And so, Steiner developed this farming practices that became biodynamic, and they involve basically a couple of things: treating the vines with preparations as they're known. They're natural combinations of various flowers and herbs and ground quartz and cow manure that's been buried in the horn, at certain places on the vineyard, and then mixed into this mixture and sprayed on the vine. These are known as preparations. And so, but to think of organic and biodynamic, organic farming just means that there's no chemicals used in the farming process, no herbicides, no pesticides. I would mention in U.S. vineyards that glyphosate, the active chemical in Roundup, is the number one applied chemical or herbicide in U.S. vineyards. And so, which is why when you drive past U.S. vineyards, you will and globally as well, but not as much, you'll see beneath the vine, it looks a bit like moonscape. It's very hard surface. It's very dark and just like lifeless. That's because it has been applied with glyphosate to keep all the weeds down. When you look at a natural farm vineyard, you'll see that in fact it looks like a forestation under there. Is no weed control at all, because that's not natural. What's natural is to let the plants communicate with each other and struggle with each other to produce their highest and best output, which in the grapevine's case is grapes. I mean, the grapevine doesn't care a thing about producing wine. It cares about producing the very best, the most delicious fruit with the most character, so that it will attract the birds to propagate its seed. But back to how you would think of the differences between organic and biodynamic. Organic is chemical-free farming. Biodynamic is a prescriptive form of organic farming. So in addition to these preparations, they also harvest and prune and make other decisions about farming by lunar cycles, which is another cornerstone of biodynamic farming. So all biodynamic farming is organic, and then there are these prescriptions on top of that, which include these preparations and lunar-based decisions, particularly around harvest. So that's the difference between the two. I want to touch base for a moment on what I talked about is loving organic farming with living soils and what I would call industrial organic. And the way I think about that is, when you go to the farmer's market and you look at these fruits and vegetables, right? And they are so vibrant. Like you just want to get your phone out and take pictures of them, right? They're so vibrant and so big and luscious. And because they've been grown on a small farm where there's just a lot of love and a lot of just dedication to soil and preparation, and just a lot of love into making that plant as vibrant as it can be, right? Well, when you go into Whole Foods, the organic produce there doesn't look like that. You don't want to take your phone out and take a picture of it. You know what I'm talking about?
Oh yeah. I mean, it looks like the food at Ralph's. Frankly, I mean, it doesn't look any different. It just says organic.
Right. So that's the difference between what I would call industrial organic and loving organic. And so the natural farm is filled with the spirit of love and the love of soil. This is reflective in the fruit quality, because the fruit quality determines, since there's nothing else that goes in a natural wine, there's nothing in it but wild native yeast and grape juice. That's it, right? And so there's no adjustments or additives. There's no new oak. There's none of these flavoring profiles. It's just honest, ethical, real wine, right? And so about 95% of everything you taste is reflective of the quality and character of the fruit berry, of the grape berry, which is why we wanted to touch on one other thing, which is why irrigation is so dangerous for the planet, right? It's a terrible waste of water. Grapevines have been growing all over the world for more than 10,000 years and had never been irrigated anywhere on the planet until the early 1970s, when irrigation came to grape farming in the United States. And we talk about that in a moment. But the problem with irrigation is it's bad for the planet, it's bad for the vine, and it's also not helpful for your health, because what it does is there's a number of things that happen. First of all, an irrigated grapevine has a root ball that's about 3 feet in diameter and about 3 feet deep, because it gets all of its nutrient and water from a little tube just above the trunk of the vine. An unirrigated grapevine at maturity can have a root structure that can span 50 feet deep. And it's just these tiny little hair-like capillaries that are every day struggling to break up little parts of mineral and soil and stone and break it apart, looking for nutrient and any kind of water that it can get, right? And so this is the reason that it develops a much, much higher quality and character of fruit, particularly with much higher notes of minerality. That being said, what happens with an irrigated grapevine is, first of all, it's lazy, right? Because it doesn't have to struggle or work. And struggle and work builds character, just like it does in humanity and other animals.
That's right. So you should raise your kids, right?
Yeah, right. Struggle and work. Yeah, it's a real. I don't know much about child rearing, but I know you're probably an expert. But
the translation of kung fu is hard work, and like I know that in Chinese medicine, that the strongest, best ginseng is the one that worked the hardest and has the gnarliest root, right? And that has the highest concentration of ginsenosides. Same thing with phytonutrients and like mountain blueberries versus the stuff that you get at the store. You want your plants to work, because those are the plants that have become more resilient, have had more hormetic stressors, and basically have a better nutrient profile.
Right. Exactly the same thing happens in the grapevine. So this is also true for organic. So non-organic grapevines do not contain the same quality of polyphenols and flavonoids and antioxidants that organic does, and the same thing for irrigation. Once a vine is irrigated, it becomes lazy. It also dilutes the polyphenols inside the grape berry with water. So when you fill a berry up with water, you get a more you get a diluted character of fruit, and you get dilution in your polyphenols. So it's not as healthy, and it also doesn't taste as good. The other problem with irrigation is that the fruit, when it's filled with water, the berry has to get riper, higher in sugar content before it's picked in order to have proper flavor development. That higher sugar results in higher alcohol. So the higher the sugar is at the time of picking, that will determine the level of alcohol during the fermentation. So this concept of why we irrigate is very simple. It's about money and greed. And irrigation is practiced all over the world, but primarily in the United States. And today, remember, I mentioned earlier that it wasn't until 1972 or 73 that irrigation came to the United States for grape farming. Before then, everything here was also dry farmed. And you know the name of our company is Dry Farm Wines. We only sell unirrigated vine fruit because we believe so deeply in this concept. We named the company around it. And so irrigation is the first intervention into nature's logic in grape farming. But here's why you do it. It produces higher yield and fruit that weighs more. When you put a bunch of water in the fruit berry, it weighs more. It might not surprise you. Fruit is sold by the ton.
Yep.
So the more it weighs, the more it's worth. The higher the yield, the more it weighs, more it's worth. It's also easier, much easier, to farm an irrigated grapevine than it is an unirrigated grapevine, just because of drought conditions and other things that make the farming practices, and particularly the soil protection and the cultivation of the mulch to lock in moisture into the soil, that all requires a lot more work in the farming process. But let me talk about just two other things before I go to alcohol real quickly, because these are also important points. Just to cover how wine is made, because many people don't know how wine is made and don't know why generally that red wine is recommended as the healthier option than white wine. And I'm going to explain. And also, our wines are sugar-free. So we'll talk in a moment kind of what makes dry farm wines different than just natural wines. But one of the things that we do is we do independent lab testing on every wine that we sell. And one of the things that we're looking for is sugar in the wine. Wines, and particularly commercial wines, commonly contain sugar. Well, we believe sugar is also a dangerous neurotoxin, and we believe people should limit it. And I personally try and live a sugar-free life. So I don't want to drink sugar in my wine. I'm also ketogenic, and so I'm very conscious of both sugar and highly refined carbohydrate. So one of the things that we test for is sugar. So a common question that we get is, how are your wines sugar-free? I wanted to mention that because I'm going to explain all of this in one explanation. So how wine is made is the juice is pressed from the grapes, and then it comes in contact with the yeast, the grape juice does, and at the correct temperature, it'll have to get a little warmer. At the correct temperature, then the yeast will activate, and the yeast begins to eat the sugar. It's the food that feeds the yeast. And the byproduct of the yeast eating the sugar is ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide. So now, here's the sugar-free element. If the wine is allowed to fully ferment, meaning that the yeast eats all of the available sugar, and then the yeast will naturally die, the wine will be fully fermented and there won't be any sugar in it. What's happening in conventional wines is that the winemaker is introducing sulfur dioxide to the winemaking process during the fermentation to kill the yeast, prior to it completing fermentation, leaving what's known as residual sugar behind in the wine. Now, the reason they do that is because people like the taste of it, and what you get are these long caramelly finishes that people tend to place some premium on, and those long caramelly finishes are glycerol, which is a high sugar byproduct. So natural wines don't have that long finish. They kind of just fall off very sheer because they don't have any sugar or glycerol in them. So that's now the difference between the red wine and the white wine. After the juice is pressed, white wine is made from free-run juice, and red wine goes into a tank with the skins from the press. So it's the skins and the seeds are where red wine gets both its color and also its increase in polyphenols. So in white wines, you have just over 200 polyphenols, flavonoids, and antioxidants. In white wine, it's a little over 800. And the difference is, in the red wine is the contact with the seed and the skins. If you squeeze the juice from a red wine grape and the juice from a white wine grape, they're both clear. So it's also where it gets its color is from contact with the skin.
What about the tannins and the nitrites and all that when it comes to these types of wines? How much of that is naturally occurring? How much of that is added?
It's in natural wines, there's nothing added. It's all naturally occurring. Right. So tannin structure would come only. Also, natural winemakers almost never, I wouldn't say never, but it's almost never use any new oak. So if the wine is aged in oak at all, it's always a neutral oak, which doesn't impart any. Neutral mean that it's probably seen more than 10 vintages. And so it doesn't impart any oak flavor profile, and no tannins, no anything. It's just completely neutral. Most natural wines are vented and aged in stainless glass, clay, or concrete. If they do see oak, or in some cases chestnut, it will be from neutral wood. And that's very important because there's some other problems which we're not going to dive down to in using new oak and methanol and other things that we believe are being imparted from these new oak programs, which are very popular in New World wines.
But that's where the tannins leach in, is the new oaks. Or
That's where you get super heavy tannins. You'll get tannins in red wine, beautiful, natural, elegant, balanced tannin structures from the skin contact and contact with the seeds. The seeds will be where you'll get most of the tannin from a natural red wine, since it doesn't see any new oak.
Got it. And then nitrite, that's just an additive in the New World or kind of processed wines.
Absolutely. And primarily, the primary additive used in bottling that sterilizes and preserves conventional wines is sulfur dioxide, which is another thing we test for. So on the wine bottle, you'll see every wine bottle, whether it's natural or not, reads contains sulfites. Sulfites are naturally occurring in the fermentation process. For any fermented food will have sulfites in it. The question is whether or not, as a matter of the winemaking practice, whether or not sulfur dioxide was added to sterilize the wine. And the problem with that, in addition to, well, there's a whole lot of problems, but one of the primary problems as holistic health leaders that we think about, and Dr. David Perlmutter, New York Times bestselling author on the microbiome, has written extensively about our wines and the fact that they contain gut-friendly living bacteria. Now, that's not true for a conventional wine because it's been sterilized with sulfur dioxide, and all these gut-friendly bacteria that are naturally alive in wine have been killed when the wine was sterilized. Natural wines do not get sterilized in this way, and so they're a lot friendlier for your gut as well.
Well, presumably high alcohol content makes it not bacteria friendly either. So you're saying that without the sugars, you have much lower alcohol content in these wines, which also make it an easier place for bacteria to live.
That's true. And so let's talk about alcohol for a moment. We don't sell or drink any wines over 12.5%. This is a very big deal for us. We sell and drink wines as low as 6%. So we sell wine between 6% alcohol and 12.5%. Today, American wines are teetering right at 15% on average. Now, most people probably don't, but they should, probably don't pay much attention to the stated alcohol in the wine bottle. But here's the other problem with that between the wine industry and their friends in Washington, D.C. The alcohol stated on a wine bottle in the United States, by law, is not required to be accurate, and many times is rounded down. So if it says 14% on the label, by law, it could be as high as 15.5%. And there's no enforcement even beyond that. So nobody's enforcing checking the validity of any of it. But under the statute, it can be as much as 1.5% higher than what it says. And so there was a reason for that back post-prohibition when labs were very inconsistent, right? And technology wasn't well developed, and how they measured for alcohol was a little bit inaccurate. That's not the problem today, right? So you can, with precision, measure alcohol quite simply from lab to lab, and it will always be the same. It's very precise, but the wine industry doesn't want that change because it gives them the flexibility to put lower stated alcohol in the bottle.
That's interesting.
Right. It's just, it's this relationship of corruption from our point of view between the wine industry and the political structure. I know none of that comes as a surprise to you, or probably to many of your listeners that is alive and well, but it is somewhat disturbing because I want truth and transparency. I want to know what I'm putting in my body. And I want to know what I'm subjecting my mind to. And while we're talking about brain health, let's turn back to alcohol for just a moment. So alcohol is a super dangerous neurotoxin that will fuck your life up and kills thousands of people every year, right? And destroys the lives of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of other people, right? And so
and their families.
Right, and their families. And so, it's always, people are somewhat surprised to hear this wine advocate, the wine guy telling you that alcohol is a really dangerous drug. But the fact is that's true. And I understand about this relationship. I've been a lifelong wine drinker. I used to drink spirits. I've had a lifelong relationship with alcohol, and it's a dangerous drug. And so I talk a lot about that. I want people to think about, we need to be honest about our relationship with alcohol. It's addictive. It's also a domino drug. What I mean by domino, just like cocaine is an example, what I mean by domino is that the more you drink it, the more you want to drink it, right? And so that's the reason that, and like most people, I don't, and most people I know, you're a little more disciplined in this regard. I've poured wine for you a few times, but most people don't have a glass of wine or a drink. They have several.
Right.
And so if that's the case, no matter what your beverage of choice is, if it contains alcohol, if that's the case, then it's best to start with a lower dose in the beginning. And the only way to do that in wine is to drink a lower alcohol wine. Most of the wines I drink are between 10 and 11%. That's just sort of the wine that I like the taste of. And I like the ability that I can have several glasses without a negative impact to my brain. And so, and without any negative remnants. So these hangovers, these nasty hangovers that people get from wine, and in particular red wine, is not just the higher alcohol, but also the additives and other winemaking practices and alterations to the wine that make it particularly unhealthy, which is why most women, many women will tell you, I love red wine, but I can't drink it. And the primary reason for that is because conventional wines are very high in biogenetic amines. The two primary ones are histamine and tyramine. And this is what causes most women and many men to feel bad. They get splotchy or stuffy or tension in the front part of their lobe, just like feeling like something heavy is sitting on their forehead. And so this generally speaking is one of two things: higher alcohol and also these biogenetic amines. But I think it's really important. Look, drug use is real. And, I enjoy getting high. And this is a nice pleasure in life, but we have to think, and particularly where addictive drugs are concerned. Psychedelics are not addictive. I mean, you do a hero dose of mushrooms, you don't want to step back up the next day for another hero dose.
You're
right?
good for a year.
Yeah, it's like, I'm good for that for a little while. I appreciate the reset, but get back to me next summer, right?
I'm gonna go think about my life for another year.
Right. So it's like, or even recreational use of psychedelics is not addictive, but alcohol is definitively and decisively addictive. And this is the reason that the wine industry loves pushing these alcohol levels up, is because it's addictive. It's a domino drug. The more you drink, the more you want, the more wine they sell. So if you're going to drink wine, which I think should be your beverage of choice for alcohol, because the alcohol levels can be much lower. If you're drinking tequila, which is clean, I agree it comes from a plant and it's paleo approved, and I understand the argument for it, but for my brain health, it's 45% alcohol. I'd rather drink a 9% wine, right? And so, which is, this 100% natural product that's got living bacteria in it, is still alive and is good for the soul and for, and for the other interesting thing about wine is that wine is the only popular beverage. We might be able to find some obscure differences, but it's the only popular beverage between the popular alcohol where the fruit, the source of the energy that is making the beverage, is both grown and made by the same person in a natural wine case. So the farmer, the natural wine farmer, is the same guy that ferments and vents the wine, right? In spirits, you've always got, one source of farming and then another source of processing. But in natural grapes, only one guy or one family is doing the whole thing, right? So it's from soil to glass, all from one spirit and one spirit energy. And I think that's really important.
Oh man, we spent a month in Italy last year with another family, and we stayed on a couple dry farm wines, and kids were just running around playing, and it was just as you said, bugs and weeds and plants and flowers and all of it everywhere, and then the family had their tradition. Like we sat at these tables, they'd come, they'd cook for us, they'd sit with us, they'd pour from these bottles, and man, I never had a single headache. Um, uh, Really, it was just this unbelievable experience, and it reminded me, like talking to you a few months back, somewhere I saw you, and we were just talking about the difference in these wineries. Is it didn't like I'm in California, I drive by these wineries, and it looks like desert with just these little like T-bar grapevines doing their thing. This place was like a plush oasis, and something you mentioned kind of stuck with me is that you want to create a dry farm wine. The first thing you do is you create a pond, let the life show up, and then everything kind of springs around it. So I want to talk about what these farms look like, because they are abundant in nature, right? And once nature is thriving, that's when I start trusting the wine. So I just want to kind of because you've seen at least 1,000 of these, because that's where you travel to.
Right. So what you generally see, and this was explained to, it's been explained by many farmers. What you will often and usually see is that they try to position a reservoir in the center of the vineyard, right? Or if it terraces down into a low spot where they can create a reservoir, because water is central to life. And water is the source that brings in nature, that brings in animals, that brings in insects, right? And so the natural farmer wants these animals, wants biodiversity, is planting, they have bees, and they'll have orchards, and they'll have olives, and they'll have all kinds of biodiversity, because this is how nature thrives. It's interdependent. What happened in the 1920s and 30s when monocultural farming came about, right, all across the world, but particularly poignant in the United States, we left polycultural or biodiversity and adapted this monocultural way of farming, which was easier, produced higher yields, of course, but less nutritious and damaging to the planet. So that really began, just after the turn of the 1900s, and has increasingly become more the practice monocultural farming. So, but this source of water brings in wildlife. It brings in energy. They see it as a spiritual energy that is in the center of the vineyard. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, I mean that's my sauce, right? I mean life basically coalesces around water, and then you have everything else springing forth. So I mean, I want to see grasshoppers, I want to see butterflies, I want to see birds, or else it's not healthy, right? The chi is not flowing in that space.
We work with a farmer in Austria who actually plants these magnificent bouquet of herbs and blooming herbs under all of his vines, right? And because in fact, there's a butterfly on his label, because he believes the collection of butterflies is the collection of life. And so he wants a vineyard filled with butterflies, and he plants these very specific native herbs and flowering herbs to attract all these butterflies. It's pretty extraordinary.
Oh,
I've never seen it before, but it's very unique to this particular vineyard. But this is the kind of thinking. These people they're not profit driven. They're thinking about soil. They're thinking about multi-generational health of the soil. They're thinking about their children and their children's children. And, most of these farms have been in multi-generational farms, so they're also very old vines. When you're in Europe, in California, the average age of a grapevine is just under 15 years. The reason is, after about a dozen years, the yield from the vine decreases significantly. So they pull the vine up and replant so that they can return to a very robust yield. Natural farms, on the other hand, don't do that. In fact, they prize the older the vine is, the more sacred the vine is to them, because they know what I know. An older vine simply produces, while lower yield, produces a much, much more superior fruit. And again, since there's nothing else in it other than fermented grape juice, the quality of the fruit determines the quality of the wine. So the average age of the vines we buy wines from is about 65 years, but some are over 100 and some are down in the 15, 20, 25, 30 year, but the average is around 65 years old. In California, average vine here doesn't even make it to 15 years before it's replanted.
Man, I want to taste a bottle from that guy with the flowers and the butterflies. I mean, that's the wine I want to drink. That's where I feel safe drinking this stuff. It's absolutely insane.
Since I'm going to see you in a couple of days, I'll just bring you a bottle.
It's so nice having friends like you. This is amazing. Hey, man, so listen, we're out of time. I know that you wanted to make a special offer to my tribe here, my listeners. So we have we set it up at well.org/wine. Make it easy for you. And so, yeah, what do you got for my listeners?
So we have a 1 penny bottle. And so legally we can't give alcohol away, but for 1 penny, we'll stick a bottle of wine in a box for you and send it to you with your order. So just go to well.org/wine and you'll find a link there to get a penny bottle.
That is so sweet. And again, I don't drink wine unless it's from Dry Farm Wines. It's the only wine that I've been able to tolerate that I actually really enjoy. My wife loves it. So, I mean, it's been a win all around. So thank you for that. That's a hell of a deal. And keep up the good work. I can't wait to meet you up in Europe at some point and just tour some of these wineries. It's becoming a really fun pastime for me. It's like organic food. It's like doing Tai Chi. It's just good things, right? Good things are out there, and all this kind of industrial, profit-driven, Wall Street, driven world of, just crushing us into submission because they just need to make more money. Our bodies are rebelling, our brains are rebelling, our kids are rebelling. It's just bullshit. It's over, right? So, like, back to the basics, back to these original formulas and practices of wine, and all of a sudden, lo and behold, you're feeling better and life is good again. So I love it. Todd, keep up the good work. I'm so happy to know you. I mean, you've been fighting this fight for a while, and I'm glad you've got some traction. The wines are amazing, so check them out at well.org/wine, and I will see you all next time. Thanks for being here. Dr. Pedram Shojai, the Urban Monk. Todd, always a pleasure.
Thanks, man.